Hey there YouTube, I'm Yukitsu, this is the Yukitsu Times. Welcome to my channel, welcome back to a little bit of Endless Space 2. So we're going to finally finish off our series on the Sophons here. Excuse me, took a damn long time to get here, but I've been playing Stellaris. Anyway, we're going over the ships today. As you can also see that we're one turn away from victory here, you know, that, if you're wondering. Anyway, let's start off by talking about their colony ship here. Now, one of the things to note about the Sophons is that their base speed on all of their ships is slightly faster than everyone else's. So if we were to take away this engine here, this still has a movement speed of 5, which is a little bit faster than other people's. I believe the Sophon trait is 2 points of extra movement speed. So the fact that this thing does not have a ton of engines and stuff like that is actually perfectly okay. We can find the trait here. I believe it is... Where'd it go? Fast Traveler's 2, so yeah, +2 movement speed on all of their ships. So the fact that this doesn't have a ton of modules on it does not matter as much because they've got that 2 points of bonus movement speed. So you could either potentially just remove the engine and have it still move a little bit faster than most other people's would for a cheaper price, or you can add the engine back in and it'll move a lot faster at the same price that a slower one would be able to go at. It doesn't have the ability to go like ridiculously fast like the model that the Vodiani can make or what the Vultures get, but it is pretty a neat trait there, and it applies to all their ships as well. So for their Detector type ship, this one's kind of okay for military, but it's a decent explorer. Again, a little bit faster, makes it either cheaper or a little bit better. The one problem is that I would like to see an extra support module slot here, because I would love to be able to get in 2 of these probes as well as an engine. This is 1 point slower than 2 probes and an engine, but it is substantially cheaper. For a defensive design, there's no there's no defensive slot, so you're looking at just throwing in a couple of weapons there, maybe a kinetic enhancer, and that's about all you're really going to get out of this thing in terms of damage. Excellent at exploring, especially if you want to explore at a bit of a discount. It's one of the best discount explorers out there. Or even a pretty okay double probe explorer, but other than that, there's nothing too spectacular about these guys. 2 weapon slots is sort of the bare minimum that you'd want from these sort of things to defend yourselves in the early game from pirates and stuff like that, but nothing too special going on there. Next up, we're going to talk about the Accelerator. This is their small class of attack ship here. So just grabbing off all of these weapon slots, you can see that the base model here, it's got 2 weapons, which is pretty standard there, and it's also got quite a lot of defense. It's got the potential to have 4 defense slots if you are willing to go for a 0 support module one. The main flaw with the base design is that it has very, very little support going for it, with only the 1 split support module type here. You're going to either have to use a module there to improve its speed. The speed of 4 is pretty okay there, just because, again, it has that fast travelers thing there. But you are looking at a sort of situation where this ship's not going to really be able to do much other than attack some other ships there while absorbing a decent amount of damage. And absorbing damage isn't really what this ship should be doing under ideal circumstances. So you're looking at a ship that kind of can dish out some okay damage, pretty average damage. It can take a beating. You're not going to be able to invade very effectively with this guy, and that's sort of going to be a consistent problem for the Sophons here. This is a type of design, once you've got the titanium upgrade, that can be used as a mono fleet sort of setup here, where you can get this thing with 3 weapons there, 4 decent armor modules there, and then 2 support modules. By that point in time, you're looking at a fairly solid ship there, but you're still not really going to want to take this thing out there with a bunch of titanium A2S slugs and invasion modules. It's just not going to necessarily be that great if you're doing it that way. Much better would be the kinetic enhancer and a movement speed bonus if you're going to be doing anything, and then rely on support ships to get the other planetary invasion stuff done. But even then, broadly speaking, this is the kind of ship that just is much, much better if it can focus entirely on getting weapon enhancers and defense enhancers, so that it can focus on getting into fights and winning them. All in all, I think it's actually a fairly decent design. There's nothing too inherently wrong with it. It's just that it's going to be hamstrung by the other ships that the Sophons have. So you can rely on that quite well. Next up, we got the Magnet. Magnet's a pretty good name for this thing. This thing soaks up fire, as you would expect, and then, unfortunately, unlike most other defenders in the game, this thing just explodes. You've got the option of having 2 defensive slots, potentially, like, 1, really, but it has a decent number of utility modules on it, so The problem with this thing is that it just does not have very good defensive module slots. It does have one weapon slot here, And then it's got a decent number of 3 the utility slots there. Like, this is quite a lot of utility modules for this type of ship without the upgrade. The problem is that, like, what are you really going to do with these under a lot of circumstances? The thing that I think that these would work well as is sort of convoy ships, or kind of a weird type of ship where you put in a bunch of invasion stuff like the titanium A2S slugs there, and maybe just have them move really, really quickly there. They can siege a planet down and have another fleet standing on top of them to defend them from attacks without actually committing these guys to a fight ever. Because with the 2 defensive modules and the fact that this is the ship that's going to be taking fire, this thing's really, really vulnerable. With the upgrade, it's not really much better. You're now looking at 3 to potentially 4 defense modules. 4 defense modules is not the worst in the world, but at this point in time, you're looking at a really overcommitted utility module ship, which you don't really necessarily need. I mean, you could go with slightly less utility modules out there, but I mean, even here, this is one of those hard calls, because having an extra kinetic weapon really can help you defend against missile attacks. So if you're up against a missile-heavy fleet, these things are terrible at their role of defending your fleets there. I just think that these things really hold back the Sophons in the early game when they're relying on this type of ship and the small attacker as well. So broadly speaking, this is, I think, what really, really screws with them. Once you've got the upgrade, still broadly the same thing, but it's potentially a little bit better at what it's supposed to be doing there. Yeah, not my favorite ship design out there. Next up, we've got the Smasher here. And this is, again, a relatively decent ship. The Sophon attack ships are not actually, strictly speaking, terrible. They're not my favorite designs either, but there's nothing really inherently wrong with them. Again, we're looking at a fleet composition where, without the upgrade, this has got the 3 weapon slots. It's equivalent to 2 of the smaller ships, which have got the upgrades, or 3 of the smaller ships if the smaller ships are unupgraded. Once it's upgraded, it's superior to either of those, so if you've got access to the adamantium, which I did not in this playthrough, this is a better designed ship there. This actually has a decent amount of defensive slots here. We're looking at 3 unsplit ones. You're broadly speaking going to want to have access to, again, these utility modules, but if you don't need it, you could squeeze in 4 defensive modules. The nice thing about that is that this means that the ship is plenty tough and durable by itself, and again, if you're stuck without any of the defensive ships to protect it, maybe it's not that bad a thing that this ship is tough and durable by itself there, and you can just rely on it to take its own beating while having a decent firepower amount. Again, if you are doing that way, you're going to have a real hard time invading other planets. This isn't going to be the most mobile fleet in the world because you don't have the utility modules, you don't have the fleet accelerators and stuff like that, you don't have the fleet-based support modules. You're going to end up running out of certain resources when relying too heavily on this type of ship there, unless you're defending, because when you're defending, you don't necessarily need those things as much. You just need the kinetic enhancer, really. If you're defending like a choke point, you don't even really need the movement enhancers, so you're going to end up with a fleet that works just fine in that particular case. All in all, I think this is a pretty good ship, and you're probably going to want to use it if you've got access to the resources for it. The Ring is the medium version of the Defender, and again, this isn't a ship that I'm super happy with, but unlike the small version, I'm not super unhappy with this one either. At base, it does start off with 3 defensive modules. That's actually perfectly reasonable. It also has a split utility/defense one, and if you want to use this as a Defender type ship, this is going to work perfectly fine for you. It does also have 2 dedicated utility slots. That's all perfectly fine. And then you've got 2 weapon slots. So this is actually a pretty reasonable sort of design if you want to be doing anything. The problem with this one, contrary to the small class ship, is that you make real big sacrifices if you want to take good utility modules. So you're either going to be a really good Defender type ship there, or you're going to be a really good invasion ship or support ship. And like modules like the H-Field Fleet Accelerators and the Titanium A2S Slugs, these are what really lets you invade other people. Without them, it's going to be a real long time before your ships get to distant or isolated outposts that could be sending fleets against you, or potentially it could take a really long time to fly to the enemy's capital. Taking things like the H-Field Fleet Accelerators really boosts the speed at which you can get your fleets to the enemy capitals there. You're going to potentially want things like the fleet repair bots there, and you're going to want things like, say, the Titanium A2S Slugs, so that once you get there, you're going to be able to beat them down a little bit better. So all of that's quite important, and maybe even like things like basic flotilla shield, but let's not think about that too much there. So because it's only got 2 dedicated support slots at the start here, you're going to sacrifice a little bit of toughness if you really want to get there to the enemy. You may want to get rid of one of the weapon slots down here for that extra utility, especially if you're not fighting against a lot of missiles. But again, if you are facing off against a lot of missiles, this is not the best model out there. It's not terrible either. 3 potential weapon slots is perfectly okay, but 1 gun slot is not going to really protect you against all that much enemy missile fire. So it's one that requires a lot of compromises to do its jobs properly. I think that you're probably going to be better off going for the full defensive model, but if you happen to be invading an enemy planet, this is going to be your better bet as compared to the small one, because it will be able to at least stick with your fleet and contribute somewhat. Once it's been upgraded, you've got an extra 2 potential utility slots there. You could go for easily 4 defensive slots there, and then go for the 4 utility modules. That's going to be plenty for both. And then you'll also have like the option to go for another utility module, or you can have the large weapon and 2 small ones. But a large and a small weapon, pretty okay against a lot of missiles out there. Unless you're against a really crazy missile-heavy fleet there, that's going to be plenty enough for you. Not the best ship in this line, but definitely not the worst either. I do think that this one's a major, major improvement, and if you find yourself getting into really intense fights in the late game, I would definitely build these over the small version for the Sophons there. And also, if you are on the offensive, basically this type of ship design is mandatory with the upgrade. If you don't have the antimatter to do these for the offensive operations, it's going to be a lot more tricky to win an offensive war as the Sophons. Next up, we've got the Collider. This is actually a fairly interesting ship there. So you can get access to it a little bit faster because the Sophons have all that extra tech compared to a lot of others out there. And this is actually tied for one of the best carrier designs out there. So you start off with 1 large and then 1, 2, 3, I believe it's 4 weapon slots there. So that's a lot of firepower, those 5 slots, including 1 large. You start off with a decent amount of protection potentially. You're looking at 4 of them, and then potentially you've got a little bit of the utility modules. Again, you're sort of looking at a trade-off between those. But I find that if you're going for this type of ship, often it pays to have the defensive modules in it, just because the ship is such an important part of your fleet. If it dies, then you're kind of screwed. Once you've got the upgrade, you've got a lot more versatility as well as a little bit more firepower. As you can see, it only really adds 3 weapon slots there, which is quite a decent amount of extra firepower, but what's important about this is that it ties you for the #1 spot in terms of weapon modules in a battleship design, or a carrier design, along with United Empire. So this is going to be a fairly fantastic ship in terms of beating down a lot of enemy ships there. Other slots that you gain access to, an extra utility and an extra defensive. This is exactly also what you want in this particular case here. It's going to give you enough to make this guy just take up all of your slots in your fleet and be perfectly viable. It's just a very, very powerful type of ship there. You do rely on getting to this a little bit faster. A well-balanced late-game fleet, I find, of mediums does tend to beat carrier fleets just because their bonuses are a little bit stronger, and because the carrier mechanics for the aircraft, the bonuses that they provide for these bombers and stuff like that, I don't find that they work quite as well against a lot of fleet designs out there, just because a lot of them will have some flak defense. But if you can get through that just fine, or if your opponent is not building that sort of stuff, then these carriers with the carrier type design here can be extremely dangerous there. And you know, you just throw all this sort of stuff on there. You throw some point defense on their large turrets or something like that, or you throw in some just lasers for extra damage, and you're going to end up with a design that's pretty dangerous out there. There's no particular weaknesses of this one that you can't compensate for. It's very, very flexible and very adjustable. You're broadly speaking going to want to use these if you can get access to them, if you have access to the resources required for them. But if you don't have quadronics and you don't have Orichalcics, then you are going to want to stick to your medium design ships if you've got the adamantium and antimatter. If you don't have any strategic resources, then obviously you can't build these guys, but other than that, you know, this battleship design, these carriers, very, very powerful and a very good sort of design in general. So let's take a look at some of the other elements of the Sophon's fleets that we could talk about here. So first of all, let's talk about their starting hero. So this is the guy that you start off with, and you've really only got like the fleet movement plus 6 movement on fleet there, And then you've got access to the Burning Light. So if you wanted to really use this guy as a general, or an admiral rather, you're looking at basically using energy weapons to gain the benefit from Burning Light, but that's all he's really got. You're realistically speaking not going to have that much luck using this guy as a fleet admiral. He's much, much better on planet. So don't really design your fleet around this guy in particular. If you want to have an admiral for your fleets, you're really going to be fishing for another type of admiral out there. Anyone you can get really would be better than him. In this particular playthrough, we only ended up getting Sophons and like this one virtual endless guy. He's a little bit better in terms of combat there, so I mean, but not very much. So you have to get lucky if you want to use Sophon admirals and stuff like that for fleets. So we're not going to go for lasers, and we're not going to go for kinetics or anything like that just based on our leader types. We're just going to have to... You generally assume you're not going to have a good leader unless you get one early. The other thing to consider are their active laws, or their general laws here. So let's take a look at past laws, hit all. Usually you can get access to industrialists depending on how you're playing. Fleet Fortitude is a very, very powerful extra type of military thing, so you can slap that on there and have your ships going off and doing their job. Mine's Bigger is something that they're almost always going to have access to. This gives you plus 33% damage on weapon modules. So you still want to max out the number of weapons on all of your ships, because this just makes that bonus from this a little bit stronger there, but it could compensate for sort of weaker designs if necessary. This is actually a really good one to activate if you've got a situation where all of your ships are the offensive designs because you've gone for just all smashers or whatever. The reason being that if you're going for that all offense design strategy, that you're hoping that you can destroy your enemy ships before they can get through your relatively durable attacker type ships. And if you can do that, then it doesn't matter that you have an unbalanced fleet design. It just it's just going to come down to you brawling it out there faster than their defensive ships can defend. The other thing that you can sometimes get, especially if you're really going for sort of all for war there, you can potentially get something like the Deadly Intent bill. It's a little bit tricky to get something like that, but broadly speaking, yeah, it's going to be Mine's Bigger that you're going to have to watch out for having. It's a pretty okay thing, but it's not the best of the edicts out there because, again, it's like Deadly Intent bill, except Deadly Intent bill has also got troop damage. So that's sort of everything we need to know about the Sophon fleet. In terms of what types of weapons you're looking at, I think that things like the magnet can be used with anything, but they don't really excel at using missiles. If you're going to want to use missiles, you're looking for fleets that have access to like more than average weapon slots, and these guys don't have that. Same thing for the Smasher. You're looking at whichever types of weapons you really think are better. Right now, I think that the sort of viable weapons are the missiles for people who have more weapon slots than average, the kinetic weapons, especially if you're going for a more defense-orientated fleet, and the long-range lasers. I haven't found a great way to use the beam lasers because they seem kind of crappy under a lot of circumstances, but if you really wanted to get the beam lasers in there, they could potentially work just as well with the Sophons. Oops, sorry, I should have been talking about the Accelerator and the Smasher, not the Magnet and the Smasher. So yeah, these kind of guys work well with those sorts of weapons. They're any kind of combination. Generally speaking, not the missiles, but you can get away with it, I've been finding. For the Magnet, you're again looking at just at point defense there. Same with the Ring. Those are just dedicated defense ships. If you really, really are confident that you're not going to need anti-missile defense for whatever reason, and I never feel confident that I don't need missile defense weapons there, you could potentially load these guys down with the kinetic weapon, or sorry, the lasers or something like that, but their weapon slots are way, way too low for missiles to be a viable option. Collider, you're probably going to want to take advantage of the Squadron Tech and the Veteran Pilots, so that you can get access to slightly higher numbers from this guy. If you don't really want to go for these guys as carriers, which is perfectly reasonable, the carriers and bombers and stuff like that can be a little bit janky from time to time, you can load this guy down with any type of weapon in the game. Like I said, it has got above average missile slots, so this is actually one of the two designs of carriers that really sort of excel at carrying missiles if you want to go down that route. The only problem is that since the Smasher has like a 20% bonus compared to it in terms of damage from the targeting systems as well as focus fire, you're generally speaking going to get more damage out of 3 of them as opposed to 1 of these guys. So, or sorry, 2 of these guys as opposed to 1 of these guys, but it's hard to say for sure. Like the number of guns on this thing, the number of 2 weapon slots there really means that this thing can dish out a lot of pain. Usually you're not going to get this until you've already won the game, though. Carriers are a difficult tech, even for the Sophons to get without being close to victory. So quite often I don't see too many of these upgraded carrier designs all that often. So anyway, that's everything about... Oh yeah, there's one more thing I would like to comment on. Generally speaking, I think the Sophon fleet is a little bit better at sort of the defensive game, especially if you're focusing on getting just accelerators and smashers and maybe a very small number of rings. If you do it sort of that way, you're going to end up in a situation where your ships are capable of just dishing out enough damage and being durable on their own. The ring is just necessary for a couple extra defensive points, especially in a really tough lane or something like that, or what you predict is going to be a really tough lane, to soak up a little bit of damage there more than the offensive type ships could do. But because they're so tough and durable, the accelerator and the smasher don't necessarily need the support from those side type ships there. The magnet is sort of your better bet in some circumstances for an invasion fleet, just loading it up with invasion modules and having it in a separate fleet that is not attached to your main fleet lets you sort of do that job there. But if you really want to have a defender that's also capable of doing a little bit of planetary invasion, you're looking at the ring. It's not great at the planetary invasion stuff. It's not really great at increasing the mobility of fleets or buffing it or anything like that, but it'll do the job okay. So that's everything really about the Sophon fleet there. I don't have a particular battle to show you in this particular case because we haven't been getting in fights. I've been pretty careful to sort of stay in a defensive stance here and not really antagonize too many of my enemies. So we ended up in a situation where there's nothing really to fight right now, but that's perfectly fine by me. So in any event, that's going to be our episode for today. I hope you found this episode enjoyable. I will be looking at probably another faction pretty soon, but I'm thinking about which one I want it to be. So in any event, hope you found this episode enjoyable, and of course, as always, hope to see you guys all next time.